And I'll hand over to our convener of the Anglo SIG, David Mendoza, to introduce our speaker today. David.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone else is not melting as I am, but welcome to the Anglo SIG. I'm delighted to welcome Jill Whitehead, who really needs no introduction to this group. I should say that as a child in the 1960s and 70s, I was a huge Doctor Who fan, and I remember us driving past a large sign outside a London police station that said Aliens Reception Centre. And I always imagined sort of Daleks and Cybermen, and it never occurred to me that several of my own great-grandparents were themselves aliens. One of them, we don't know why, but maybe due to family scandal, remained an alien until she died in the 1950s. But hopefully today Jill will provide me with some clues. So Jill wrote two important Shemot articles on naturalization and citizenship in 2013 and 2015, and you can find these on the JGSGB website. And today she's really bringing us up to date with all her recent research. As you know, Jill is on the JGSGB Council, has written widely for Shemot over the years. She is also a researcher for local history in suburban South London, and a long-time researcher of the Suwalki Lomza group, a former group, from which areas actually some of my own alien ancestors beamed down. So please join me in welcoming Jill as our speaker today. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see your Zoom. If you click on the bottom on the PowerPoint logo, you should get to your presentation. There we go.
Minor hiccup. Thank you for attending today. I hope you find the presentation interesting. I've been looking at naturalisation since 1997, as that is the starting point of my research for my family. I found naturalisation certificates and the supplementary information provided with them absolutely key in finding out all about my family. The family information that you can find from them is amazing, yet a lot of people never look at them. And it's not only the information, the certificate itself, it's where it can lead you to, the family leads. And I deliberately picked this photograph for my front slide because I got 4 naturalisation certificates from this family. This is my Brown family from Edinburgh, so Harvey will be pleased I'm starting with the Scottish angle. This features my great-grandparents, Janet Brown and Benjamin Brown, and they were first cousins. And Janet, by the way, was a Cantonist daughter, and that will be the subject of an article in Shemot coming up. But Janet and Benjamin came to Edinburgh in 1870. They were aged 15 and 11, and they came with Benjamin's 2 younger brothers, Lewis and Philip, who were 8 and 6. And as far as I'm aware, they were unaccompanied. And they came to join Benjamin's elder sister, Janet Michelson, and her husband and baby child. And Janet's first child born in Edinburgh, Claude, was key in getting a lot of the Edinburgh community naturalised in the 1890s. So I have 4 certificates. And then, just to add to that, Janet's mother, Rebecca, my great-great-grandmother, came over in the mid-1870s with her 2 youngest children, Leah and Arthur. And I also have his naturalisation certificate from later on, also gathered by Janet Michelson's son. So without more ado, I will move on. So, as mentioned by David, I wrote 2 articles in 2013 and 2015. First of all, looking at the impact of the Aliens Act, which was quite significant in this country. People decided to stay or to go. And I got quite a lot of interest from people who read that article. So I wrote another one 2 years later, which looked in more details about how to find out information using examples from my family. And the photograph here is of my grandmother, Hannah, and her father didn't get naturalised. He came over in 1867 and he didn't get naturalised, one, because he was in Manchester where it was really difficult to get naturalised, but he had a whole host of other issues, which I'll come on to later. And it was more difficult for me to find out about that family because they weren't naturalised. Let's look at the history. So we need to be aware of what the history was in Victorian times. We had economic recessions. It's a bit like today. Every so often you get economic recessions and people start getting concerned about what's causing those economic recessions and how they can be sorted out. And there's always a need to find a scapegoat. And unfortunately, aliens, if you like, particularly Jewish aliens, proved to be scapegoats. And it was particularly difficult during the 1890s. That's when Jews felt very concerned. Should they stay or should they go? And immigration restrictions were proposed during 1880 to 1890, but more left than came. And then the xenophobia got worse. And during 1890 to 91, there was a fear of the Tsar unleashing 1 million Jewish migrants. And of course, this was fake news. The figure was nearer 60,000, and most of them didn't go to the UK. They probably went to North America. But even so, from the mid-1880s, there was a clamour for an Aliens Act, and various attempts to get one failed until closer to the First World War. But nevertheless, there was a need to naturalise by long-standing residents who'd been here for 20, 25 or 30 years, including my great-grandparents. Eventually, an Aliens Bill was enacted, but it was not fully enforced to World War I. Let's look at the British Nationality Act. This was all quite complicated and it goes right far back. Before 1844, one of the main ways was denisation, but this came from the Crown and it didn't offer civil rights and it didn't offer rights for children. So in 1844, this came under the British state. So you could get naturalisation by grant from the Secretary of State. This was the British subject status, and you were at that time treated British from the date of naturalisation. But of course, now that's not the case. Naturalisation is only one of the steps you have to take now to become a British citizen. But in those days, you immediately became British citizen on naturalisation. Also in 1844, a foreign woman could become British by marriage to a British subject. And then in 1870, we have the 5 years residency requirement, which is up for consideration now in 2025, where the government here is planning to change this to 10 years. Also in 1870, the Act included children under 21 years living with a naturalised father or widowed mother. This hasn't always been the same, and it changed with wartime and other things happening in the economy and so on. So children under 21 years were included at this time, but they weren't always included in the future. And children over 21 years and those who married partners, they had to get naturalised separately. In 1914, the Act included widows and divorcees, children over 21, but only on reaching 21. And a lot of the changes in the Acts were due to the status of the British Empire and the British Commonwealth. So there are various changes to the Acts over time that reflected these changes, particularly towards independence. And it was all a bit of a mess. So in 1914, the British Nationality and Status of Alien Act was put forward so that the situation right across all parts of the British Empire, whether it's Australia, Canada, was the same. And I've recently been contacted by a lady in America who has people who went from Britain to Canada, a rabbi, in fact. And he was in quite a bit of a difficult situation. So this 1914 Act standardized his situation. But over time, the ethos and feeling of being Canadian, for example, increased with the move to independence. And so in 1946, you had the first notion, for example, of a Canadian Citizenship Act, which you also had in Australia and New Zealand. But you need to look at individual countries to see what the situation was there. And of course, we're all familiar with the Windrush generation after World War II, because those were British citizens from the West Indies who came over. And finally, in 1948, which actually astounded me. This was the very first time that women were treated as entities in their own right. And a woman could then choose to become nationalised or not nationalised according to her own requirements rather than a husband for the very first time. And it's worth mentioning the Aliens Act in 1905. This introduced stricter controls, and this was in reaction to the way people were feeling nationwide. So it's rather similar to what we've got now. People are rather concerned about people coming into Britain and people coming into any other country. And so in 1905, there was an attempt to stoke all of this. So authorities were given the right to deny what were called undesirable immigrants, those lacking means of support, in poor health, with a criminal history. These aliens could be taken out, but people could also stay because there was an asylum clause. And at this stage, it's probably worth mentioning that even before this act came in, there's rather a famous alien who couldn't get naturalised in Victorian times, and that was Karl Marx. He didn't get naturalised because he was felt to be rather a dangerous person. Now, looking at my family, I've got here all my naturalisation certificate information for my immediate family. And these give the name of the person, the profession, and there was a bit of artistic license with some of the professions, I might say. The family still under 21 at home, where they lived, and when they became naturalised. So it wasn't always successful the first time. So, for example, Aaron Guttenberg on that page, he attempted to become naturalised twice, but only succeeded on his third attempt when he moved from Hull to Great Grimsby. And the reason for that was that he had been made bankrupt twice. So if you've been made bankrupt or you've been involved in a court case, it was harder for you to become naturalised. But as I say, 3 of my 4 great-grandparents, Joseph, Aaron and Benjamin, did become naturalised, and 2 of Benjamin's brothers and his cousin. And they had a range of occupations. They were mainly furniture dealers, but they also dealt with other things. They did a bit of pawnbroking on the side, they sold some jewellery on the side, this, that and the other. And all of them lived in the north of England or Scotland because all my ancestors emigrated from the Suwalki-Lomza gubernias to northern England or Scotland between 1865 and 1875. And when they naturalised in the 1890s, they'd been here for 25 to 30 years. So they were long residents. Information sources. These are the main information sources where you can find out about nationality. The London Gazette, the National Archives, Ancestry, who have naturalisation certificates between 1870 and 1916. And of course, you can find out from census records, as you will see the words Nat BS, naturalised British subject. And I'll go through each of these in turn. And just to point out that the picture on the left is Arthur Brown with his 3 children. And he benefited a great deal from naturalisation as all his 3 children were movers and shakers. Let's start off with the census statistics. So at the top, you've got 1881. This is for Joseph Salmon Servian, who was my great-grandfather in Liverpool. So you can see that he was a glazier and picture frame maker from Russian Poland, from Augustów. His wife, Ada, came from Suwalki, and his children, Leah, Jacob, and Samuel, were born in Augustów. And Samuel was my grandfather, the only one of my grandparents to be born overseas, and he was brought over as a baby. And if you look on the top right-hand side, you will see the word aliens has been written next to it. But fast forward to the 1901 census, Joseph is now a naturalised British subject because he became naturalised in 1893. And on the right, it tells you that he is born in Russian Poland, but in brackets, he's a naturalised British subject. But on this occasion, you'll notice he's not living with Leah, Jacob or Samuel. He's now living with his 3 grandchildren, Reuben, Bertha and Rose, because Samuel's daughter Leah, unfortunately, died of typhoid in 1894 whilst living in North Wales. And it's notable that 2 of the grandchildren later moved to America to be with their father, who had remarried. So you can see the movement between 1881 and 1901 from an alien to a naturalized British subject. And this is Joseph Servian's record in the Discovery Catalogue of the National Archives. And when you enter the information you require, you will need to put in a surname, then a comma, then the first name for the information to come up. You cannot get a copy of this from the National Archives digitally, but you can order a copy, a print copy, but this does appear on the Ancestry website. So what do you get? The front page of the certificate. You have the name of the person, Joseph Servian, an alien, his address, which was in Everton, the name of the government minister, who was Herbert Henry Asquith, who later became Prime Minister, and he's given as subject of Russia, having been born at Southwark, and that's their spelling Poland. And this is something you have to be careful when looking for information, the multiple spellings of where our ancestors came from. So Southwark is spelt here, S-U-V-V-A-L-K, but it has multiple other spellings. And he's given as the son of Max and Hannah Servian, that's Mordecai and Henya, subjects of Russia, and gives his age. He's a glazier and has 2 children, and it gives the 2 children living with him. And of course, his daughter Leah wasn't living with him, and she was over 21, and she was living in Wales. And this was just a year before she died. So that was as it was. At that time, the name of the wife was not given. The name of the wife was not given until 1914, which gives you the idea of how women were treated in those days. Fast forward to 1914, when there was a change in how this looked. So this is the naturalization certificate for Aaron Gutenberg's brother-in-law. So his wife, Bertha, her younger sister was Rebecca, and her husband was Solomon. He'd come many moons before, but he didn't naturalize till 1915. And he had to naturalize during World War I because he got an absolutely fantastic contract to make uniforms for the Army and Navy, the British Army and Navy in World War I. So obviously you couldn't really have an alien making uniforms for your Army and Navy. You had to become naturalized. And in the meanwhile, they'd got married in Hull and had 12 children, mainly girls, but 3 boys, one of whom died. So on this occasion in 1914, there were 2 changes. One was that the wife's name was appended, which was new, but children couldn't be naturalized till they reached 21. So here you have 2 sons of the family who were over 21, but they never themselves naturalized. And I think if they'd had more sons, this would have put them in quite a difficult position. So each of the sons probably would have had to become naturalized when they reached 21. But wartime meant that children living with their parents were no longer counted as British citizens. They had to get naturalized on their own. But again, this gives the information on the left that's broadly the same as appeared in earlier times. This time it's in print format. This is a carbon copy, and this shows that Solomon Berkowitz came from Kovno. Aaron Gutenberg, as I mentioned earlier, he took 3 attempts to become naturalized. He failed to naturalize on 2 occasions because he'd been made bankrupt twice in 1875 and 1887. And he only succeeded because he enlisted the help of Henry Feldman, who was the future first Jewish Lord Mayor of Hull. And he was Lord Mayor of Hull, I think it was about 3 times. So he's quite an important person in the community. And he succeeded by moving from Hull to Great Grimsby. In actual fact, it was his holiday home at Cleethorpes, which I don't think has quite the aroma it had in those days. And unusually, which is rather bizarre, bearing in mind he became bankrupt twice, he became treasurer of the Grimsby community, although this did have religious differences, and it was a split community, as indeed the Hull one was at that time. There were quite a lot of arguments between various of the communities which he became involved in, and I think he only became treasurer because of some of these splits, but he became treasurer in spite of his background of having been made bankrupt twice. And This is the information that I got. This is from the supplementary papers, and they're well worth getting. So the supplementary papers give the places of residence. They were only required to give the last 5 years. Most of my family actually gave the last 10 or 15 years of places they lived in because I think they felt it was better. But also Aaron might have been required to give the last 10 years because he had moved. So he's given 5 years of residency in Hull, even though he was there longer, and 5 years of residency in Great Grimsby. This gives his 4 local declarants on his behalf, including Henry Feldman, the future Lord Mayor, and it gives specific information, police investigations about the discharge of his bankruptcies in 1875 and 1888. This is why the supplementary papers are so important. And if you have a look down where I've got the red line on the side, it says the bankrupt had not kept such books of account as are usual and proper in the business carried on by him, and has sufficiently disclosed his business transactions and financial position within the 3 years immediately preceding his bankruptcy, that the bankrupt had on a previous occasion, viz. On the 19th of July 1875, made a statutory composition with his creditors. Upon these grounds, the court in August 1888 ordered that the bankrupt's discharge be suspended for 6 months. So that put him in a very difficult position for naturalisation, which is why he eventually went to Great Grimsby and why he got the help of Henry Feldman so that he could eventually become naturalised. Now let's have a look at the ancestry search. So these are the aspects that you need to click. So you click search, you click immigration and emigration, then citizenship and naturalisation, then you find the UK naturalisation certificates and declarations 1870 to 1960. There are none before the 1870 Act and none have been produced after 1916. When I did my original article, they only went as far as 1912 and then they added up to 1916, but we've got none after 1916. But that's the page you get. So you're asked to put information about birth, time and places and any event and details of any family members. In my experience, it's actually better to put a minimum amount of information. I find the more you put in, the more it complicates things. So if you know where they live, for example, in my case, Hull or Liverpool, then that provides useful information that will bring up a record. And this is what you get for Joseph Servian. So I have my ancestry family tree on Ancestry, and because of that, it recognized there were 2 people potentially with a name Joseph, so it included my aunt there, Joseph's granddaughter. So I could click on Joseph Servian because that came up and put it in the search box. And then this is the record that we get showing that he comes from Southwark. And you click on view record. Now, this is a very important page because you get so much information all in one go. So you get the detail below, which is the transcription of what's on the original picture. You've got the original certificate on the left, the information in the middle, which shows that his birth was 1844. And I have records from JRA Poland to show that he was born in 1844. He was born in Suffolk. He was actually born, that was the gubernia, Suwałki gubernia. He was actually born in Sejnie in Suwałki gubernia. So you have to be aware of whether you're talking about a town or a gubernia. And he was living in Liverpool in 1893. But you have all this other information at your fingertips on the right-hand side. So you can then find Joseph in the 1881 census, 1891, 1901, and 1911 censuses. And you can find a family tree on GNet. And his original name was Josiel Serwianski. So all that information is available on Ancestry for you to click, just starting off with the naturalization records. And there's things you can do. You can play around. You may find this a bit daunting, but I'll take you through it. So this is to do with in-laws. So you can find out about in-laws sister and brothers-in-laws, and daughters and sons-in-laws. So Nathan Abraham's at the top. He was one of my great-grandparents who didn't get naturalised, but two of his children married two of the children of Benjamin Wanscott in Manchester. And he naturalised in 1877. That was relatively early, but his origin is only given as Russia. But with the Brown family in Edinburgh, you've got Maurice Stunger, who is the brother-in-law of Philip Brown, and Maurice Greenberg, who is the brother-in-law of Arthur Brown. And this gives you information about where they came from. And in fact, Maurice Greenberg is yet another Cantonist ancestor, which will feature in my article, another plug. It also gives you information of what their occupations are. But Aaron Gutenberg, because he had a large family, there's a lot of information for his sons-in-law, but also for his brother-in-law Solomon, right down at the bottom. And all the others are sons-in-law, apart from Bernhard Steele, who is the brother of Isaac Gutenberg's wife. And Bernhard Steele is notable because he was a business partner of Michael Marx, as in Marks and Spencer, and he came from Krakow, whereas all the others came from Suwałki, Łomża, Kovno area. But you can get all the information about your in-laws, both brother-in-laws and sons-in-laws, which is quite enlightening when they got naturalised and where they went to. So you've got a range of regional places here. So I'm afraid I don't have any for London. So I've got Manchester, Edinburgh, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Belfast, Bristol, Hull, quite a range of places where they went to. And I think there's quite a lot of connections with these people, even before they came to Britain, and they just increased the connections when they came over here. And you can find further information. Here I'm going to look at Maurice Wigram, who is one of the sons-in-law. And this is the Leeds database. And I found the Leeds database was very useful. So it not only gives the residence and date of naturalisation, it gives you more information that you can interrogate. So this gives the census for Maurice for 1891, 1901 and 1911. It gives his burial place, his date of birth and his date of death. So in one place, you've got a whole host of information. So for those that have relatives in the north, particularly in the Yorkshire area, and the Leeds Jury database does include people from other parts of Yorkshire, that can prove very useful. But the reason I've chosen Maurice Wigram is because this is a line that's very interesting. Many of our lines perhaps are ordinary, they don't do anything, they just stay there. But his is a high achieving line, as you can see here. So his son was Lionel Wigram, who was an explosive expert, and he blew himself up at Monte Cassino in Italy in 1944. But I also want to focus on that he was the husband of Olga Wigram near Jockelson, and Jockelson is going to appear again in a few minutes when I go through all these certificates. But his great-grandson was Lionel Wigram, who is the producer of the Harry Potter films. I have to say I've never met him. I've met his father, but not him. But this is a line that seemed to consistently produce someone who was well known, and yet none of the other lines did very much. So that makes it more interesting as a family historian when you find a line like that. And as you can see in the middle, he did meet Winston Churchill. And this is something else you can do. So you can play around with these statistics. So as my ancestors came from Suwałki Gubernia, and I'd previously done this exercise when I was on the board of Landsmen, the Suwałki Łomża interest group, I downloaded all the ones I could find of those who'd been born in Suwałki Gubernia and Suwałki town and other places connected to Suwałki who had come to Britain. So this is a selection of them from 1882 to 1906, where they went to in Britain. And again, variety of places, Linlithgow in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Manchester, London, Birmingham, Leeds and Cardiff between 1882 and 1906. A range of ages and a range of occupation. This was a totally random table. So 2 days after I'd done this table, I was contacted in My Heritage by this person in America who said, I see we're third cousins on My Heritage. Do you know anything about my Selinsky or Galinsky ancestors from Leeds? And there you see on that table, Abraham Selinsky from Leeds. So that was quite an amazing coincidence, really. I never expected that to happen, finding a third cousin through doing a table, but there we are. But also you can find examples of revoked citizenship. And this was on Ancestry. And this, I found this when going through all the Suwalki records, because this person came from Suwalki as well. And he had become naturalized in 1909, but he had the misfortune to marry someone in Hamburg in Germany in 1914. And it looked as though he stayed in Germany. And of course, because we were at war with Germany, his citizenship was revoked. And all this information is on Ancestry. So it gives his marriage record. And it's interesting that there's something appended to the record for July 1954. So it does look as though he did stay in Germany, but I'm not quite sure what happened to him. I don't have enough information to be sure, but his citizenship was revoked. Now, moving on to the Gazette, and I've got the red mark on the bottom. You need to key in naturalization and then the name of the person you're looking for, because the Gazette covers all sorts of public records. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it includes things like who's going to be in the King's Birthday Honours List. But if you want naturalization records, you actually have to key in naturalization, comma, then the name of the person. And then you get coming up the London Gazette, the issue and the page number. So you click on that. And as you can see, I've got the page that says Joseph Servian, comes from Russia, naturalized 1893, lives in Liverpool. Now, there's other interesting information on that. So you don't just look at your own relation. Look, he's got a Rothschild above him. I thought that was interesting, finding a Rothschild above him. But also further down, if you look, you'll find Alfred Jockelson. And a few pages back, we had Olga Jockelson, who married Lionel Wigram. Well, that is Olga's ancestor, Alfred Jockelson. So he's actually on the same page as Joseph Servian. So I came across a number of coincidences like this. So it pays to look through the whole list, because you inevitably find somebody else on that list. And in fact, that's what happened here. I looked at several pages from the London Gazette for spring 1893. And I found not only Joseph Servian, but Lazarus Gorfunkel, who was now Aaron Guttenberg had two children who were married to two children. This is a common theme of Lazarus Gorfunkel on my mother's side. So he was naturalized just a couple of months after Joseph Servian. So I've got someone from both my father's side and my mother's side on the same list within a short period of each other. And the other thing you could really do if you really wanted, and I haven't got round to doing that, is that one could map all the addresses that appear on those naturalization certificates. And that would give you an idea of where the Jews of Liverpool lived at the time. And in Liverpool, many of them were actually involved in glass dealing, which my great-grandfather was. It was a particular local speciality in Liverpool, glass dealing and picture frame making. So maybe one day I'll get round to doing a map of that area. And also on this list, also of interest, David Hesselberg, who's under Lazarus Gorfunkel. When I first started researching Liverpool 25 to 30 years ago, David Hesselberg, Sikh, was the local archivist for the Jewish community. And this David Hesselberg is his ancestor. So you not only find your own ancestors, you find other people's ancestors you know as well. I now want to move back to Scotland and talk about Claude Isaac Michelson. So he was born in Edinburgh in 1870, and he was the nephew of Benjamin Lewis and Philip Brown and of Arthur Brown. And his mother, Janet Brown, married his father, Harris Michelson, and she was the eldest of the Brown family who came to Edinburgh in 1868. And importantly, he was born not only in Edinburgh, but obviously grew up in the Scottish educational system. So he knew how to write proper English, he knew how to communicate in English, and he knew how to deal with the bureaucratic authorities, which was the most important thing. And he was also one of these people that sort of become a myth and legend in the family and people looked up to. And this is something else I found in the supplementary papers. It was a letter from Claude to the Secretary of State. saying, I need to get this right. He obviously hadn't got it right with his first attempt, which was with Lewis Brown, the middle brother. He said, I need to get this right. And it's all to do with the bureaucracy, what he had to append, how long they'd been at an address, and all the rest of it. He said, can you tell me where I've gone wrong? Because I've got another 33 to come. He was doing the whole of the Jewish community at that time. So he was acting as their agent, if you like. And this is what I found with my other ancestors in other places. They had an agent or a solicitor who dealt with their naturalization. So in Liverpool, there was a solicitor called Linsky, and he acted for my great-grandfather there. But in Edinburgh, Claude Michelson, because he'd been born in Edinburgh, acted for the Jewish worthies of Edinburgh at the time. And in fact, you can trace these. So that's my great-grandfather Benjamin. He lived till he was 90. And you can see on the right-hand side in the London Gazette, you've got Lewis Brown at the top, and you've got Philip Brown in the middle, and you've got Benjamin Brown at the bottom. And also, just to point out a couple of other interesting people on there, as you do, you will find in the middle Simon Addleston, who also came from the Suwalki area. And he was one of the ones I found when I was doing the work for the Suwalki Lomza Interest Group, as he came from Calvaria and he went to Leeds. And further down there, immediately under Philip and being naturalised the day after, is George Camberg. As some of you may know about the Camberg family, the George Camberg was the grandfather of the novelist Muriel Spark. So Muriel Spark's grandfather was one of the ones that Claude Michelson did the naturalisation for. And as I say, he went right on, and he also did Arthur Brown in 1902. But there was a rush to naturalise, which I mentioned early on, when we had these economic downturns and fear of aliens. Whole groups of communities naturalised to rush at the same time. And in Leeds, this is when I picked up from the London Gazette. These were 29 naturalisations that took place in a month. It's a 5-week month, which were published in the London Gazette on 3rd of August, 1894. So these were the Jewish names which I picked out. And near the bottom is Harrisstone, and I believe this is Harris Finkelstein, who was my family's lawyer in Sheffield eventually. But I picked at random a name there who's not a relation, Marx Elias Libsohn, because again, I could find him on the Leeds database. So again, this one shows where he was living, and he obviously changed his residence quite a bit. So that would be of interest to anyone who is descended from Libsohn. So again, that database is very useful. But not everyone naturalised. It was a postcode lottery, and the more Jews you had in one town, the harder it was to get naturalised. So where you had towns like Hull and Manchester, it was very difficult to become naturalised, and not a lot of them did. It was also expensive. In those days, it was £5. Which is about 50 or 60 pounds today. And if you can imagine, for Aaron Gutenberg, he did it 3 times. So he paid out £15, which is 150 pounds plus in today's terms. And that rose to 40 pounds in 1975. But today it's 1600 excluding the ceremony, but that's only part of the story. So today you have to go through these other hoops. So the amount of money you can spend on becoming a British citizen today is quite phenomenal. And there was the danger of being rejected at the first attempts, as you saw with Aaron. So it wasn't only bankruptcy, it was court cases. And this was an issue with my 4th great-grandfather, who was involved in several court cases. He was very litigious, and that didn't help him becoming naturalised, not only because he'd been involved in court cases, but because it took money away from him that he needed for other things. More on that in a minute. Here we are. And this is one way that Jews in Manchester could become naturalised. Between 1896 and 1909, there was what might be called the equivalent of the National Lottery. You paid your money in each week, and I'm not quite sure whether it was weekly or whether it might have been only monthly. There was a prize of a naturalisation or the payment for a naturalisation. And he obviously didn't succeed. He had come in 1867, but he hadn't naturalised. He'd had 9 children in all, 8 of whom were born in Manchester, and of those 6 were daughters. And he had a lot of financial burdens. So even though he entered in February 1900 paying 3 shillings, I'm not even sure he kept it up. So that record is available on Find My Past and Ancestry. And I don't know if there's any other records to show that he paid any more, but he didn't win. So I think our family's unlucky. We never win anything from lotteries anyway. But he was a cabinet maker. He had to pay marriage dowries, including for my grandmother who married in 1900. So this is a picture of her with me when she was a very elderly lady. And you saw the picture right at the start of the presentation of her with her young family. But he was involved in a very infamous lawsuit. And he was involved in several lawsuits, but one in particular, his apprentice had been taking things from him. So he took him to court. And the judge, and it was known to be an anti-Semitic court case, judged that because he didn't pay his apprentice enough, his apprentice had the right to steal from him. So that was the basis of it. So that obviously impacted him both financially and on his reputation. But he did have other things to fund. And he had two brothers, one of whom was an elder brother who had 10 children, whom he obviously helped to go to St. Louis. The elder son stayed behind and he obviously helped him set up in Birmingham. And he had a younger brother who used Britain as a staging point, and he helped him to go to St. Louis. So he had quite a lot of call on his finances. So I think in the end, the naturalisation passed him by. But it didn't really matter as far as I'm aware, because I don't think it really affected him. But I want to point this out, talking about aliens. Some of you may not know about this. So about 20 years ago, the Manchester Police Force found these records, alien registers from the Salford City Police. And they contain the names of non-UK citizens living in Salford during the First and Second World War. And I think the point here is, as it says, although they may have moved to the city much earlier, the Alien Registration Act of 1914 forced all foreign nationals to register with the local police forces. People who were deemed enemy aliens could be deported or interned. So I found these records quite useful, but I couldn't quite work out what it was all about. When I got this match, Samuel Servian. My grandfather was called Samuel Servian. And I thought, this can't relate to my grandfather because my great-grandfather was naturalised. And you're right to think it was a relation also called Samuel Servian, a cousin. And he had arrived in Salford after having been naturalised in America. He had lived in Britain. He had various addresses. He was a cap maker. He had a factory making caps in Broughton and lived in Broughton. He also had a factory making caps in the USA. And he had come from Kovno, and this gives the details of his landing at Liverpool, the need to report to police, and the details of his American passport and naturalisation. And you could track this in British record. So you'll notice that he emigrated to the USA in 1893. So 1893 was one of those points whether you stayed or you went. So he was in the 1891 census in Manchester. And this is the information from his naturalized record in America. And it shows that he lived in Liverpool, it says, rather than Manchester between 1888 and 1893, and in various months in 1914. And it says that he's going to be visiting Liverpool again to visit relatives in 1922. But in fact, I was able to track Samuel over 10 years on Ancestry with the migration, well, not the migration records, but the travel records between Liverpool and New York. He came every year during the 1920s, and he was only allowed to stay for 3 months, but he actually spent 6 months in not Liverpool, but Manchester, and 6 months in New York to oversee his cat works. So that you can track on Ancestry, which is quite interesting. So that is an alien who got US naturalization rather than English naturalization. And what about those who left? What happened to them? With the Servian family, there are a number who left. So Joseph Servian's younger brother went to Chicago. His first wife had died in 1895, and the photograph below is in 1895 of him with 3 of his 4 children. So he then married again, and when the Aliens Act came in, between 1904 and 1906, he and his children went to America at different times. So he went with his new wife, then 2 children went the following year, and 2 children went the year after that. Then Joseph Servian's son-in-law, Max Goldblatt, who'd been married to Leah, who died of typhoid, he'd remarried and had 3 more children with somebody else in Bradford. So he then left in 1905 with his second wife. And then Max Goldblatt and Leah Servian's children, 2 of them, then went to 1907 and 1912, his daughter marrying Barnett's son. But it wasn't only families that were split up when they left because of the Aliens Act, it was friendships. And I found this out because when I went to the 2008 Chicago International Jewish Genealogical Conference, there were loads and loads of records in the courthouse there of British people who'd moved around about 1905. They'd moved a second time. They'd been in Britain for a very long time, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And a lot of them moved to Chicago. And this courthouse in Chicago had loads of these records. So I not only found them and found my own family's records, I also found a copy of Sophia, and that's Sophia Hilda in the picture, of her will. She married, but the marriage didn't last long because her husband died. And she left all her money to her best friend at school in Liverpool. And her best friend had left for Port Elizabeth in South Africa in 1905, and they'd kept up their friendship. So families and friendships were split by the 1905 Aliens Act. Now moving to the present day, well, nearer to the present day, this is the 1940s, World War II. So some of you will know from a past presentation I made that I had a Jewish family from Austria that lived in my house for 46 years. And they came from Vienna in 1939. So we have here the certificate from the National Archives for Helen Jukes and her parents Leopold Lippmann and Georgika Jukes, dated 1947. They were quite an interesting family, and again, I can show you their certificates. And you can see, I know it's difficult to read because it's carbon copy again, and it's essentially in the same format as 1914, that Helen Jukes is now naturalized on her own. And in any case, she was over 21 years. She was a teacher and she taught at an English school in Vienna, interestingly. So she was fluent in English. Her parents, it's got there as being Austrian. And then you've got the information about her father on the right-hand side. This was 1947, so her mother was naturalized with her father. And it wasn't until the following year in 1948 that women could be naturalized on their own. And he came from what became Holochev in Slovakia, which when he was born there was Galgosh in Hungary, which is near Bratislava. And Georgika, the mother, she came from Segled, which was near Budapest. And it also gives the details of Leopold Lippmann's parents, Marcus and Jeanette Jukes. And they ran an international agricultural company that covered the whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they lost everything before they came over here. But it wasn't only them that got naturalized. There was another family member. So their nephew, Ladislav Jukes, came over with the Czech company. He'd gone to Palestine and been refused entry. He then joined the Czech company and fought in the Battle of France. Then he came to Britain, where he joined the Czech Pioneer Corps of the British Army. And he'd had a lot of very difficult situations. And you can see here a marriage for 1941, which I believe was a marriage of convenience, with another refugee called Ilse Sarah Feuerstein, and she came from Posen. And the people witnessing it were Joanna Wallach, who was another refugee, and also Georgina and Leopold Jukes. And I don't believe they ever lived together because he spent the time in the army, and then after the army, he was admitted to Tooting-Bec Psychiatric Asylum with severe problems, which would be called PTSD. And he lived there for the rest of his life until the 1980s. Whereas Ilse moved to North London. So she was naturalized at her address in North London in 1950, and she stayed at that address for the rest of her life. So you can find all sorts of information. And this shows you how you can cross-reference. So you could cross-reference a naturalization certificate with the female enemy alien and also the marriage certificate in 1941. So there's all sorts of information you can get from these naturalization certificates. But I just want to finish with today. Things are a bit different to 2025. I think throughout the Western world, there's a concern about aliens and migration. And now there's no automatic route to citizenship for foreigners. You can no longer claim it through marriage to a British citizenship, and you no longer have a birthright. even though you might be born in Britain to non-British parents. I know somebody who's Italian around here who was born here, but their parents are Italian and they have Italian citizenship. They don't have British citizenship. And up to 2025, after 5 continuous years living, working, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain. And then after that, you can apply for naturalisation and then a British passport. And the government is now planning on making that 10 years. That's up for consultation, I think. But you also have the pathway to citizenship. So you have the Life in the UK test, which is a sort of general knowledge test, English language requirements, visa categories, evidence of financial stability and good conduct. So you have to pass all these hurdles, and each of them have a cost attached to them, which none of our ancestors had to. So naturalisation was a good thing for our ancestors. And if you could afford it, it was the best thing you could do, because you didn't have to report to the police and you didn't have to emigrate to another country. And so those living today are the living beneficiaries of those who did naturalise all those years ago. And it was also the same in the 1940s when people escaped Hitler in Central and Eastern Europe. But it's not the same now, so it's far more difficult to get naturalised now, and it sort of has a different meaning, really. So that's a summary of the information you can find on naturalisation and certificate, what it meant to our ancestors, how you can find out the information. And I hope that if you haven't already looked at naturalisation certificates, you will do, or you'll share your experience of naturalisation with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. And I'd like to call for a round of applause for your presentation. Thank you. Right, if you would like to ask a question, assuming you've got your breath back, Jill, do feel free to raise your little electronic hand, or I think I can see all 40 of you, so you can raise your physical hand as well, and I'll do my best to spot you. David, do you want to start us off?
Thank you, and thank you, Jill. That was absolutely excellent. It's more of an observation that for some of us whose ancestors came much earlier, the 1730 law allowed people who were born in this country to effectively be treated as citizens, although sort of common law recognized that right even earlier. So it's quite long established. But many thanks for the talk.
Okay, go to Jeanette next.
Yeah, Jill, thank you. Excellent presentation. I popped a bit of a question in the chat asking about what exactly you look for on Find My Past. You said you had talked about the naturalisation lottery, and I guess I've got a bit of a postscript to your talk. I went to Carmel College for my sixth form, so I left in the early 1980s when I did after my A-levels, and I can still remember the non-UK citizens having to go by minibus from school to the local police station to register with the police because they weren't UK citizens in the early 1980s. So things hadn't really changed, or certainly hadn't by that stage. But if you can tell us about the records on Find My Past, that would be superb.
Well, I actually found them by accident originally. If you actually Google the Manchester Naturalisation Society, you will come up with the information. And I think the Manchester community itself also has information on it, because I think I might have found it on there before it was on Find My Past and Ancestry. So it's in several different places, but if you Google it, it will come up. But there is, for my family, there's only one record for when they paid 3 shillings in 1900. So I don't know if the records are complete or whether they're partial.
Thank you. That's great.
All right, thank you for that. We'll go to Louise next.
Jill, fantastic talk, brilliant talk. I am related to the Addlestons through my Aber line from Leeds.
Oh, great.
Simon Addleston and Rachel C. Aber. So Simon Addleston is my, 1 second. Oh, it's not coming. Oh, I'm trying to see what the relationship is. Husband of the sister-in-law of my great aunt.
Yeah, because when I did this for the Milwaukee Alums at Interest Group, I also had someone in America who claimed descent from them. But that was a long time ago. I don't know if I don't think I could probably find them, unfortunately, but you might already know who they are.
And going to the naturalisation documents, I would encourage everybody, if anybody's been naturalised, to go to the National Archives queue, because when I went twice, well, I've been numerous times, but for my great-grandfather on my mother's line, the police report said, "Why have you not mentioned your eldest son?" And the response from my great-grandfather was, "He is of extremely bad character and over 21 years of age." And when I went to Israel, I found out from my mother's first cousin that had I heard about him, and I said no. And he apparently committed manslaughter. And he went to America under a pseudonym, and he used to correspond with my grandmother, and that's why my mother knew so much. And he and his daughter came to Leeds under their pseudonyms. And my mother remembers him coming and his daughter Dorothy. And I traced the family, I found the passenger list, and I corresponded with Dorothy's daughter. And he was the most despicable man, and the newspaper articles are too horrific to put on my tree.
Wow.
And then the other naturalisation was I'd been given the front sheet of the naturalisation document by a granddaughter of the person. And that's what I presumed was correct for many years until I went to the National Archives and I had time. And this person that naturalised was my great-grandmother's brother. And in that document, under his mother's name, scribbled between two lines, was her maiden name. And that maiden name was my own maiden name. And that's how I got a story published in Woman and Home magazine in 2011 about my research.
Very good. Okay. Thanks for that, Louise. We'll go to Harvey next, Scottish royalty.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Jill. Really enjoyed that. It's refreshing to have a speaker mentioning a lot of Scottish information and Scottish sources. I want to make 2 points if I can. One is that interesting about the Manchester Naturalisation Society. We have in the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre, we have an edition of the Glasgow Jewish Weekly Times in Yiddish in 1914. And there's an advert for the Glasgow Jewish Naturalisation Society. And it's founded by the Dr. Herzl Lodge, one of the friendly societies. And it says, in English, it says, "A call to the Glasgow public. Remember, you're strangers in a strange land. You may live here for years, but if you're not naturalised, you remain strangers. Therefore, see to it that you don't miss the opportunity you have now." And it goes on, and it talks about, it says, "Don't hold back from this. A Jew must have a home. A home is very dear. Therefore, become English citizens," which very strange that they're saying English citizens in Glasgow. But anyway, it says you can pay for this at 1 shilling per week. So the Glasgow Jewish Naturalisation Society was allowing people to pay into a fund for their naturalisation, which must have been helpful. And they were also providing English lessons. But the other point I wanted to make was that sometimes in the naturalisation files, you can find information about the original name. So an example that I made note of was 1911, Herzl Wojciech from Kovno province in Kovno Gubernate in Lithuania. He says in his application, I adopted the name of Harris Schulman when I came first to this country about 11 years ago. I did so because my own name in Russian was difficult to pronounce. So I thought this is a great example of what we all know, that people often change their names because they thought that people wouldn't be able to pronounce them. So, but I found that on a number of occasions that deep in the naturalization file, you find sometimes the original name, which is really useful. That was all.
Thank you, Harvey. I seem to have my own hand up, so I'm going to make a few comments and ask at least one question, if I may, Jill.
Yeah.
In my experience of working with the background papers at Kew, I found two pieces of information that weren't on the certificate and were really helpful for my research. So if anyone out there hasn't looked at those background papers, you really must. They don't exist in all cases. They're not digitized, but you can go along and order them if they exist, and they're on the catalogue, the Discovery catalogue at Kew. But those bits of information are the maiden name of the mother of the person naturalizing. On the certificate, it just has her married surname, but you can actually get the maiden name as well. And the other key piece of information on the background paper I found is the date of immigration. And that can be quite a hard thing to work out, although, you can sometimes estimate it by looking at which children were born in the old country and which were born in the new, and averaging those, and you might get an estimate, but it actually states when that person immigrated. So hopefully that's helpful, but I would just come up with what I think is a quick question. You mentioned on Ancestry that they were certificates and declarations, but you never really said what a declaration was or showed one. Could you just explain what a declaration is?
Yes. So you had to get some worthies from the place where you lived who could vouch for your purity, I might say. That's probably not the right word, but that you hadn't got up to anything and that you were a valid person to do business with. So the four people that Aaron Gutenberg got to be his declarants, they were pillars of the business community. So the people he dealt with in his business was, which dealt with furniture and jewellery and pawnbroking and all the rest of it, they were people that he did business with, and they were well known in the community and they had standing. So that's why he got the future Lord Mayor of Hull. So they had to be someone important. It's like today, you're getting someone to sign your passport. For example, I was a councillor for 3 terms, and people engaged me to sign their passport declaration because I was a councillor. In those days, it would have been a JP or someone who was important in their trade. So it was someone who was important in the community. And at that time, you had to get 4 declarants. I don't know whether it was always 4, but in the 1890s, it was 4 declarants.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Before we go to Rick, I'm just going to call on Jackie because I did see her physical hand. And if you still have a question, if you could unmute Jackie, and then we'll come back to Rick.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry, I can't see how to raise the little hand. Thank you very much indeed for the talk, Jill. I wondered, my mother was naturalised in 1950, and I do have her certificate here, and I've got the Gazette page, a copy of the Gazette page. What I want to know, because I've tried to find at the Kew site, is supplementary information, possibly declarations, I don't know, but I haven't been able to find anything. Would there be something there?
There should be something. I think one of the things you have to be aware of, when I got the supplementary papers, which was 25 years ago, there weren't any data protection restrictions. And now there are data protection restrictions, and I think it's harder to obtain them. And I don't know whether this would come under the 100 years rule or a number of years rule as well. But I think nowadays you have to prove that you're a close relation of the person. So as a daughter of a mother, you shouldn't have any problems. If there are any papers, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily very much in the papers, but they should contain the basic information information that's required for the naturalisation. I don't know whether there is an issue with the timescale because it's 1950 on this. I think that's something you'd have to find out. But I would have thought that being the daughter of a mother, in terms of family relationships, you should be able to obtain those.
Thank you. So should I write
Right to Kew? I would contact the National Archives and ask them, because certainly the way I got the information on naturalisation for the people who lived in my house, I did it during COVID, and I asked for a freedom of information request. So if you can't do anything any other way, ask for a freedom of information request. So the information of the Duke's family wasn't available unless I made a freedom of information request. But since I've made the freedom of information request, that information has been made public. But I had to ask things that they don't give you the information that's in the naturalisation. You have to ask what you want from the naturalisation.
Right.
So as I knew what's usually contained in the naturalisation papers, I asked for the information that my relations had already got. So I don't know if everything I got is included, but I was told there wasn't much information for the Dukes. For people who come over in wartime, I'm told, certainly for the Duke's family, there wasn't very much information there, and that they'd given me most of what I'd asked for.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just in case people didn't see what Jeanette wrote in the chat, she's saying that many supplementary papers are still with the Home Office and haven't reached the National Archives yet, but there is a helpful guidance docs document or research guide, I think they're called, on the TNA, the National Archives website. And just a quick comment from me, it is quite common to have to go through the Freedom of Information Act process. It's a lot easier than it sounds, but many times you go and the papers are locked. You put in one of these before you visit and it only takes a few days, it gets unlocked, and then you're told if you're successful and you know you can actually get at the documents. So that's helpful. Okay, we'll go to Rick next, and I do see your hand, Gina. I will come to you in a bit. Rick.
Thank you so much, Jill, for an absolutely masterful talk, as you always do. Your talks are always something to look forward to, as indeed your articles. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention. As so many people have mentioned before, do, if you can, go to Kew and look at the supplementary papers of your naturalizations, because there is an absolute wealth of information there, well worth looking at. And also, again, from Kew, you can, the one scanned by Ancestry End in 1916, but at Kew, you can get much more recent ones. I mean, my great-grandfather, one of my great-grandfathers, was naturalized in 1926 after 9 years of trying, and I managed to get his naturalization certificate background papers in 1995. So that gives you an idea of how recent you can get naturalization. And one quick point, there was the lady who had the marriage of convenience, and her first name was Ilsa, and you called her Ilsa Sarah, and on her another document you had relating to her, she called Ilsa Sarah. It's highly likely that she was not born with the name Ilsa Sarah, because for those of you who don't know, under the Reich from 1936, all Jews who had to have their identification papers, and all male Jews were given forcibly the middle name of Israel, and all female Jews were forcibly given the middle name of Sarah. And so when you see somebody with the middle name of Sarah or the middle name of Israel, and the papers referring to them are from between 1936 and 1945, and they were from the Third Reich, then that may not be the middle name they were born with. So a little bit of information worth pointing out. Otherwise, thank you very much indeed.
Interesting.
Thank you, Rick. We'll go to Arlene next, and then I'll come back to Gina. Haven't forgotten you, don't worry.
Just a quick comment. Thank you so much, Jill. That was really, really informative. Excellent talk. Thank you. I just wanted to say, as a person who got naturalized, that it was really very, very hard. To each year, you had to go to the Home Office and sit there waiting to get renewal for your residency for an extra year. And you knew you were totally in the hands of that immigration official that was sitting there. If he didn't sign that you could stay for another year, then you were out. So I have a great sympathy for anybody who's seeking naturalization. And I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, Arlene. We'll go to Gina next, and I'll come back to Joanne. Gina, if you could unmute.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I've recently obtained some naturalization documents for somebody whose tree I'm doing. It was for his father. He's 85 years old himself, this gentleman, and his father was naturalized in 1931, and he knew nothing about it. And I managed to get them very easily through the Freedom of Information Act. I just sent an email basically to National Archives and explained that it was an 85-year-old gentleman who wanted his father's papers and that he doesn't use the internet. And they not only did they give me everything, but they sent me a taster in the meantime by email. They sent me about 10 pages by email while I was waiting. I couldn't believe they were so helpful. Anyway, I'm just in the middle of preparing that for this fellow. And it's going to be a lot of information that he didn't know about. It's very interesting, the supplementary information.
No, the National Archives are definitely very helpful. And
yeah, they were really
I was there a few days ago. And if you remember, Jessamy Carlson has spoken to our society a few times. And yeah, they are amazingly helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Gina. Next question is from Joanne. Or Joanna, I should say, sorry. If you could unmute, Joanna. See if I can help you.
No,
there we go.
That's it. Several things. Have you seen in the press recently about an Asian gentleman who stole lots of money from friends and relatives saying he would get their naturalization and didn't? So he's obviously a nasty piece of work doing that. Somewhere up north, I'm not sure where it was. So, you know, he's obviously made a lot of money doing these false declarations for people, whatever, which I find quite interesting. My maternal grandmother gave her youngest daughter the forename of Sarah. She was born the day the Scharnhorst was sunk, deliberately, because of what was going on, and she knew about her ancestry, but we didn't know about that until recently. So that's an interesting name with Sarah in the family, whatever. But the whole thing of naturalization, I've got that my paternal grandfather was on a boat going to America in 1908, came back, was in the 1911 census in Triallo, right? Married my grandmother in 1917 and then naturalized in 1919, which is, I think, quite interesting that he, and he got, I think, the fact that he'd been in the army and been given the Silver War badge because he was invalided out, helped him get his naturalization. It's just quite an interesting mixture of what went on.
Okay. Thank you for that, Joanna.
I'll have a look at the supplementary papers to see if I can find any more on him.
All
because
right.
my first cousin who lives in America is trying to get citizenship for the area of Europe that our grandfather came from. Whether he's successful or not, I don't know.
Okay. All right, Joanna. Thank you for that. I'll go to one waving hand, and then I'll come back to Barry. But I'm afraid I don't know your name. But RWINF in a red shirt.
It's Roger.
Roger, hi.
It's
Go
Roger
ahead.
Winfield. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm waving my hand rather than my yellow hand. I thought I'd just share an experience regarding FOI requests at the National Archives. As a number of people have now said, making a Freedom of Information request is very simple because the National Archives have made it simple. But I had an experience which is worth mentioning, and they refused my request. This was a great aunt who made her application for naturalization in 1948. And I got terribly excited, and my wife got terribly excited because did we have a spy in the family that they refused to open the file? So I was advised to make an appeal, and making an appeal was extremely simple. All you do is said, I appeal, and the appeal went through, and the consequence, which is the most interesting part, was that to open the file, they had to be certain that all the people, including the descendants mentioned in the application, were deceased. And whilst I believed that they were deceased, I didn't have the information about one of them. And the National Archives did the work. They did the research, and they came up with the date and place of death of that particular relative, which enabled them to release the whole of the file. So I thought, remember, don't get put off if they say no first time, appeal.
Okay. I think maybe it's like converting to Judaism. They're meant to say no 3 times just to check you really want the document or something. But yes, thank you for that, Roger. We'll go to Barry.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Jill. Very interesting. Would you, I've asked this question to other knowledgeable people as well. You've obviously studied this in great detail. I wonder, would you consider those of you who've got the supplemental will probably have had the same experience as me, as that's the only place where I have an actual day and month rather than just the year of birth. So it's like I'm giving the full information. My question is on an 1896 application, which gives the day, month, and year, would you rely on that any more than on 2 previous documentations, a marriage and a birth certificate, I think, of a son, different, and on a passenger list, and on a later census, different years were given? I have no way of knowing the correct year of birth. I'm wondering if you feel the naturalization supplementary information with the date, actual date, is more reliable or not necessarily, as some people have said to me.
I don't think you can ever know, quite frankly, because I know from my own family that a lot of them on both sides, even when they came to this country, lied about their age. And this was particularly the case with the Abrahams, who didn't succeed in getting naturalized, that I still don't know when my grandmother was actually born in Manchester, because there's an official date, there's a family date, and there's a school date, and all of them differ. And that was the same for all of her siblings. So I don't think you can ever be sure. And I'm not even sure they even knew themselves, quite frankly.
Well, giving a special day and date, because that's supplementary. In my experience, I've only got 2 of them. Both give the day and the month as well as the year. So I thought maybe being so precise, but you're agreeing.
They weren't precise. They weren't precise in those days. They did what was most convenient for them.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have enough information to be sure. Probably it's pretty accurate, I would guess, but you cannot be sure because you don't know what the motivations were when they made the application.
Yeah.
So they could be trying
totally
to.
different.
Yeah.
And yet there's a 10-year, 15-year range in my
Well, that's
great
quite a lot, isn't it? Yeah. I
yeah.
don't think you could ever be sure. We just really don't know.
So would you say the same for profession? I mean, I have 3 professions in the 90s, 1890s, with the one on the 1896 a naturalization paper is Draper, but he's also commercial traveler and general dealer on.
It's the same thing because I've got it. They did all 3. So they could have been a draper and they could have been selling their wares on the road. I have this with all my relations. There's a lot of artistic license and you'll find they were doing the same thing, but they gave different answers on each succeeding census as well as on the naturalization certificate. Yeah. And they probably wanted to get the best impression when they put it down.
Tough one.
Can I comment on that briefly? I actually think the naturalization background papers are pretty accurate because I think they've got a lot to lose if they don't get it. And I do believe the government checked. And I can just think of one of my great uncles, and there was a lot of discussion about why his birth date was different from other sources. So it's not like a census where, you know, the women tend to get younger as the censuses proceed. It didn't really matter, I suppose. It was all statistical. But if it's really, you know, you're trying to get naturalized, you're trying to get citizenship, I think police are checking, government offices are checking, then it pays to get it right, really. So
I think it also depends on the area at the time. So I think it might have been different, say, in Victorian times and early 20th century. So it does depend on the time and who you were dealing with and which part of the country. So I think there's a variation. We don't know what their motivations were, but I certainly agree it's probably more likely to be accurate, but we still don't know.
Right.
And then very possibly nobody else has experienced this, so I wouldn't have the answer. I find it extraordinary that another member of the family, also 1896, naturalized. The day after the date of the paper, he left for South Africa. It seems extraordinary. Do you have any evidence or anybody to suggest that they knew in advance what day it was going to be rubber stamped?
It did take a long time. When you look through the background papers, the drafts, I noticed the ones for the Edinburgh family, it probably took all in all about 2 years, one and a half to 2 years to go through the whole thing, because you see all these drafts where they're dated one date, then there's something else 6 months later, because they're doing all this checking up. So it may be, if it takes a long time, they might have had an alternative to what they were going to do if they didn't get it. Because the bureaucracy in those days was probably even worse than it is now, because certainly my ancestor, Claude Michelson, who took on all these 33 people in Edinburgh, he was taken on because he could navigate the bureaucracy, but he found it difficult to navigate the bureaucracy of the Home Office. So they had a lot of bureaucracy to deal with.
Yeah. All right. I have a ton of other questions, but
okay.
There are others.
All right. We'll go to Keith next, if I may. And then I think I saw Jeremy's hand waving, so I will come to you next, Jeremy. But Keith first. If you can unmute. Let me try and help you. You see a dialogue? There we go. Oh, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. I do lip read a little bit, but probably not enough to pass it on. I'm afraid, Keith, all I can suggest, I know you've been waiting a long time, is that you type it in the chat and we'll do our best to respond before the end of the meeting. I'm sorry, but we can't hear. Yeah. Okay, let me move on to Jeremy. If you still have a question, Mr. Frankel.
Actually, a comment, since we're all stuck on supplementaries, it takes me back to the early 1990s when I applied online to Q for 4 of my Königsberg naturalizations, and the wonderful view of seeing the New York letter carrier coming to my front door with these huge boards within which were wrapped the printouts of the supplementaries Part B naturalizations, which I still have. in those between those two boards, and I think that the National Archives were able to print, you know, so large and then mail them all the way across the Atlantic to New York for me. It was a pleasure to see them and still review them today. And as you say, learn so much, and the various addresses, and in one case going back 25 years, so there was a conflict between that and what the Metropolitan Police report was saying, which in itself was very interesting. One of them, Harris Königsberg, had done rather well, though he was treated in the Labour reports as one of the worst sweatshop owners in London, but he happened to sit on the board of the Great Synagogue with Rothschild, which I think is why it got him his citizenship eventually. Anyway, thank you, Jill, for a wonderful lecture.
Okay, thanks for that, Jeremy. Keith, you want to have another go?
Any better?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, first of all, Jill, thank you very much for such an informative and very, very interesting talk. For me, particularly the part about your great-grandfather being a glazier and living in the Everton Valley in Liverpool, because my great-grandfather was also a glazier and glass merchant living in the Everton Valley in Liverpool at more or less the same time. So it may well be that they were friends. My grandfather was, he was a glass merchant, so they may well have been competitors. So there's a good chance, I think, that maybe they knew one another, and let's hope that they were friends. My grandfather came from Kovno, particularly the town of Vilkovichis. So I don't know whether
that's actually Suwałki Gubernia.
Yeah.
So they probably did know each other, and something of interest there, which actually impacted on what happened in 1905, whether they got naturalized under the Aliens Act. There were so many similar careers, crafts in Liverpool, and there was probably an oversupply of glass merchants, but also other ones like furniture dealers. And my great-grand-uncle Barnett, he had his shop around the corner from my great-grandfather. So both of them, as relations, were in competition. And if you take that on a greater scale, with all the people they knew that they came over with from Suwałki and your family, there were so many of them, and they were in competition, that there were too many of them in one space.
Yeah.
So that probably was a reason that led to some of them migrating, because they couldn't make a living because of the competition in Liverpool.
Yeah.
I wonder how. Yeah, mine too, Glazier Liverpool. Glazier is a fairly wide profession, I understand. I don't know how we can find out exactly what aspect each of them were doing. Right? The glazier was a catch-all for, I guess, installing windows, selling
picture frame maker, mirror makers. A lot of it was for furniture, mirror makers and picture frame making.
Yeah, we wish we could know. I'd love to know. Was that a wealth? Do you think it was any sign of, or what status could we associate with a glazier and the other?
It was a craft. It was a craft. It was a sort of middle class craft. So, but I don't know why it concentrated in Liverpool. And I think there have been in the past scholarly articles on glassmakers of Liverpool, but I can't lay my hands on them. But it's something worthy further research, I think. We've got three people here today.
Yeah.
But I'll bet none of you have the greater story on that. And my family name was Szklakiewicz, and Alexander Bajda told me Sklar is glass.
Ah.
No. I just finished with this now. I on the last census that I saw for my great grandfather, whose name was David Walensky, the address was the address of his shop, and I've now looked back onto Google Maps now, and that shop still exists even today as a DIY shop. So there's some kind of continuation there. So yeah.
Very good. Okay, thank you for that, Keith. Our final two questions will be from Peter and then Jeff. Peter.
Yes, Jill, hi. Again, congratulations on a very detailed talk.
Yes.
My observations relate to later in the century. My father came over in August 39 and was eventually naturalized in April 1948. And I received quite a lot of papers from the National Archives, three of whom I should just refer to. The first appears to be a checklist that was prepared showing what had been done. And one of the sections was adequate knowledge of English. And I think there's a degree of license given here because it says spoken adequate, which I'm not sure he really mastered by 1948. And certainly written is adequate, and he never got to write Latin script in his life. So he never wrote a letter as far as I'm aware. So that's fairly good. What's also interesting is there's a section on finances, which tells me how much he earned, where he worked, how much he had in a savings account, and what rent he paid for his apartment. So that I would not have known, and that's really interesting. The other interesting thing is, which I find quite paradoxical, is that along with the London Gazette, where the naturalisation record, shall we say, appears, he was also asked to supply 2 entries in the Daily Telegraph, which much like at weddings when they ask, you know, if anybody knows why they shouldn't be married, please speak up. Well, the Daily Telegraph ran such a sort of thing about being naturalised. And the paradox is, of course, my father was a lifelong socialist. He never read the Telegraph, and I guess he would never known anybody who read the Telegraph. So he was on fairly safe ground there. And the last thing, which I knew, but obviously seeing it in black and white, is a special branch report on my father. And it's very short, so I'll just read it. Metropolitan Police records contain nothing to the detriment of the applicant or his wife. But then it goes on, records show he married Greta Heilbronn, a German, at Hampstead Registry Office on the 24th of May, 1945. 1946. And those of you who are old enough to remember that the 24th of May was what we as school children used to call Empire Day. But police have seen no evidence of the death of his first wife, who apparently has never been in the United Kingdom. So this is clearly written by somebody who has no knowledge of the Holocaust whatsoever, and didn't refer to it. So just merely pointed out that there's no record of her death. So I thought those were interesting points. A lot of information is actually supplied. So it's, as everybody has said, it's certainly worth, you can get all this not online, but you can certainly make the application online. You don't have to go to Kew, unless you want to, of course. And be sure to ask the right questions about, you know, what it is you actually want. But it's very helpful information, and I knew where he'd lived. I knew that, well, obviously the people that spoke for him, one of whom was his employer. So quite a lot of information worth having. Thank you.
If anyone's getting scared off by the prospect of going to Kew because you live too far away or in another country, don't be afraid to ask the question of maybe on JGSGB Discuss, and someone will probably be prepared to go for you, get the document out, take pictures of it and send it, including me. I don't live that far away from Kew, but if I suddenly get 1,000 requests by tomorrow, I may struggle a bit, but next time I'm there, I'm certainly willing to help out. Okay, thanks for that, Peter. And we'll go to Jeff for our final question. If you could unmute, please. See if I can help you. See a dialogue? There, no.
Thanks.
There
okay,
we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about alien certificates. I've seen a little tiny book for my maternal grandfather who remained an alien all his life, his wife too. They were stateless all their lives. And he arrived had a very long and complicated journey to get here from Poland, which he left in 1920, including changing his name, changing his age, using forged papers, and so on, and basically achieving a passport eventually by deceit. We always suspected in the family that he it sounds like a rude thing to say, but this is what the family said, that he would never apply because he was terrified of being called up by the Polish army, which is basically why he left Poland. He did not want to be conscripted. Anyway, that's by the way. Is there somewhere where alien certificates are searchable? Is there a database of these somewhere? That's my question.
Jill?
I only know about the Salford thing, and that was the police thing. So this sounds like it's records. Reading through the police database here, they only found the Salford records by accident. So it sounds like you'd need to go to your local police force, and it sounds like it's something that might have been destroyed years ago.
Yeah. Okay, that's good advice. Thank you.
No, I believe that's correct. And the only one I know of that have survived externally are in Salford, but they may have been passed down in your family. So I certainly have some for my great grandfather, and they're very precious. But you've got to be quite lucky to get hold of them. Jeanette, do you want to comment on that? If you could unmute.
Yes, I do. Thank you. There is a very tiny collection of the certificates from the Metropolitan Police held at Kew, but the sample is so tiny, it's probably worth discounting from starters. And actually, the point that Jeff made about people being scared to be called up was one of the points invariably addressed in the Jewish Chronicle by the census authorities and leaders in the comments, you know, the editorial leader column in the Jewish Chronicle just prior to every census, explaining to the Jewish community why it was important to complete the census and why the UK census would never be used as a means of encouraging people to be, or getting people called up to serve in the army, because that was a known issue in the run-up to censuses. And you'll find that if you look at Jewish Chronicle leader columns before various censuses, 1881, 91, etc., and onwards, it's one of the comments made every time. Just thought that might be a useful addition. Thanks.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette. And actually, I just remembered one more question I wanted to ask of Jill. But before that, a quick comment based on something that Arlene said. And a cousin of mine, also a friend, she's American and went through British naturalization, and they're forced to do these terrible tests to prove you know enough about British life. And I just wanted to say, I don't think many of us on this Zoom would be able to pass those tests. You know, you can learn it, but if you're already British, doesn't mean you could pass that particular test.
Yes.
Yeah, my question for Jill was about the percentage of either people or Jewish people that actually naturalized. I was just wondering if you had any good sources for that sort of information, because, you know, in my experience, none of my 8 great-grandparents naturalized. All of my 4 grandparents were born here, so they didn't need to. And so it was only family members who were children who came to this country that went through with naturalization, because when a generation went by, they were a bit more affluent and could afford it. So I'm always quite curious to know, is there a percentage available that would tell us just how many people naturalized, either just in the Jewish population or in the general immigrant population?
And what the advantage of it was.
There aren't any figures, and it did depend on the local community. So you needed someone to go tub thumping in the local community to get them to naturalise. So in Edinburgh, it was Claude Michelson who collected them all together. And there was evidence this happened in Leeds, but in other places, it was very difficult to get naturalised, as I mentioned, such as Hull and Manchester. So it did take individuals. So there was no coordinated attempt, but I understand that the chief rabbi, certainly in the 1890s, was encouraging Jewish communities to think how they could get their members to become naturalized, because he saw that as a way of cementing the Jewish presence in Britain. So certainly in late Victorian times, I think the chief rabbi was encouraging communities, but it was up to individual communities how and when they did it. So they had their own reasons for doing it, but I think that on the whole, they felt it was safer to be naturalized than not naturalized, because then you could be seen as a Briton, and often the next generation could be seen to be more British than the British. They wanted to be seen as British. And I think actually, if Harvey's still here, I think he once did an article on Scottish Jews showing them wearing their tartans, which shows that they wanted to be completely assimilated. And that was what people wanted. They wanted to be seen as British. That was one of the reasons they did it. And it helped the business. And certainly you got other things happening, such as the Gutenbergs in World War I, who were by now based in Sheffield. They changed their name to Graham because they didn't want to have a German sounding name. So there are all sorts of things happening like that. But certainly there's no statistics, and it did depend on individuals encouraging groups to naturalize at the time. It wasn't coordinated in any way.
Okay. I'm going to go to Judith Joseph, because apparently I missed her physical hand, even though I said I was going to be the last. But Judith, could you unmute?
Yeah, got it. Hi. One of the reasons, haven't I? I have unmuted, haven't I?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Oh, good, sorry. One of the reasons they may have been naturalizing in 1900s is because the pension came in. And if you weren't naturalized, you wouldn't get a pension. That's one thing. It's these details. And as for not registering births, many people were scared to register a birth because it might be inclining the government to think of them in some years' time, to be taken away for the army, as it was in Russia. So those kind of things came in. Also, there was no money and not much language. As to the glazier situation, glazier is a very broad term. And what you find is if you look at the location of where people lived, it's more likely they were in the poorer areas rather than those, not only those who had shops were middle class, but majority were in smaller, more denser populations of the less affluent, that is the real working class tenement world, where to be a glazier was 2 boards on your back with some glass in between, and you were really a peddler of it, but it was a polite term because that's what you mainly did. And that is for people who had no English, rather like peddlers generally. So I think one has to think small and look at the location of where people lived, rather than thinking this is a craft larger.
But it was because they were here for many years. The whole point was my family, my grandfather had been here for 30 odd years when he he had 4 shops.
Yes, but your grandfather's different.
Great grandfather.
The gentleman who was talking about sorry, I can't see from the different pictures who's who where.
I think it was Keith.
Is it Keith? Sorry, it's not absolutely always one size fits all, and it's useful to think where people were, their exact location. That's where the censuses are very useful, because you look at the old maps, and some of the streets people lived in are no longer there, so you have to look at the earlier maps. But there's just the detail.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Harvey, did you want to make the final comment?
Thanks, yes. One way of, I'm also intrigued and interested in knowing what percentage of the Jewish immigrants naturalized. And it occurs to me that one way of doing this is to look at the census records, where often it will say naturalised British subject or not. When I looked at the Jewish community of the Gorbals in 1901 through the census, I looked at like nearly 5,000 people, and I calculated that there were like nearly 800 heads of household in the Jewish community at that time in the Gorbals, and I calculated that only about 60 of the heads of households were naturalised.
60 out of 800, did you say?
Yes.
Right.
Very low.
You know, but I mean, people were having big families. A household could easily be 6, 7, 8, people. So you wouldn't expect, you know, a very high figure. But it'll be interesting to look at other censuses and to do some sort of calculation. I'm surprised that nobody's ever done this, or maybe they have and we just don't know. I quite often tell people that maybe 10% of the immigrants naturalised because it was an expensive business.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
I certainly looked on the National Archives website and there was no data in their helpful naturalisation guides, but maybe it's a PhD or project waiting to happen. But yeah, okay. Thanks for those comments, Harvey. I'd just like to call for another round of applause for Jill for answering all of our questions, listening
and
to
thank you to
our
Jill
comments.
as well.
Yep, and
thank you
again
to everyone.
Yeah, again for the presentation. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.